Hey guys, it is Courtney from Willis Bloom, and today we're having a look at the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp situation, specifically looking at their astrology to kind of figure out what their personalities are like, what they might be bringing to the table in this scenario. And there's a lot to get through. I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible to get to everything. What I want to do is look at Amber Heard's chart and her personality, Johnny Depp's chart and his personality, the Synastry, so kind of how they interact and work together as a couple, as well as the transits that they're going through right now to kind of show what might unfold or why this is all happening right now for them. Okay, so I wanted to start off with Amber Heard, who has two aspects of T-squares. So she has a T-square here, which just means that there are two squares and an opposition combined to make this little triangle. So you see that she has one right here with Mercury, her moon opposite each other, and then they're both squaring Neptune here in retrograde. She also has a T-square where she has Chiron opposite Juno. These are both asteroids, but so maybe other people wouldn't consider this, but I look at them a lot when I look at people's astrology because they are very potent. Juno in particular is a marriage asteroid, and so we will see this come up significantly in relationships, talking about partners and your dynamic with your partner. So she has this in opposition with Chiron, which is an asteroid related to pain, and they're both making a square to Jupiter in Pisces in her 8th house. So I'm going to kind of break down what I think these are contributing to in her life. I also want to talk about the recent diagnosis that one of the expert witnesses on Johnny Depp's team gave to Amber for having BPD and histrionic personality disorder. And I wanted to kind of follow that up in relation to her chart and how we might see some of those potentials come alive within certain aspects of her chart. I will say a lot of these aspects, I'm going to mention the negative and kind of exaggerated form of the aspects. Many of you will have some of these aspects in your natal chart and will not suffer necessarily from the most negative versions of it. Think about everything on a scale. You can have an aspect that's challenging that on the lowest end of the scale is going to be relatively unfortunate, but not too bad. And then on the high end of the scale can be extremely intense and lead to some disorders or some other issues in your life. So just keep that in mind if you have some of these, that I'm going to the extreme in order to express some of these elements of her chart, and that might not apply to you. So don't take it personally. Okay. So I wanted to start off first with her moon in Libra opposite Mercury in Aries. So moon in Libra, this is an individual who expresses her emotions best through partnership. At least she thinks so. She wants to, right? She has this like strong and deep desire to be in a partnership. But there's also this other side of her with Mercury in Aries that is more mentally focused on herself. There is a little bit of this element of bulldozing. Aries is a warrior sign. It's ruled by Mars, which is a planet of conflict, of disagreement, of winning at all costs. And so there can be, especially with the opposition to the moon, there can be this kind of polarizing part of her personality where she, on one hand, really craves that connection with others, this intimacy, this relationship. And on the other hand, she is kind of a little bit more feisty with her words. She definitely is very much opinionated and will take a stance that can be, again, polarizing. That doesn't necessarily contribute to her desire to have a relationship. So these two parts of her are pulling in opposite direction. They're really at odds. And both of them are squaring Mars and Neptune. So a lot of what I'm seeing here is particularly her inability to see things clearly. So when someone has Mercury opposite their moon, there can be this volatility in their emotional nature. So on one hand, they can be extremely logical, very intelligent. They can come across as level-headed. And then other moments, they can just be extremely emotional and irrational and unable to see things without their lens or their perspective. So they have trouble with objectivity And they can tend to project their personal emotions onto other people, especially in their close relationships. So they can tend to see things that they are thinking and feeling as actually being something that the other is doing. And so they are projecting very strongly what is going on internally onto the other person. So let's say that she gets jealous, she would then project that onto her partner and think that her partner is being jealous or her partner is being manipulative or anything like this. It can also make someone very easy to anger, especially with this square going on with Neptune and Mars. And in particular, the thing that is most concerning is that with this tight square with Neptune, there is a strong disassociation from reality. Mercury squaring Neptune provides a ample or fertile ground for strong imagination, which can lead to seeing things in a distorted reality and straight up lying to people. It doesn't necessarily have the same manipulative tendencies as Pluto, where you are thinking that, I don't know, she does have a strong Pluto though, so this will come into play later. But typically Neptune just kind of is seeing things the way it wants to see them. So it is lies, but it's almost like she is believing her own lies, if that makes sense. So she really does have a distortion of reality, especially with the moon squaring Neptune as well. She like this, the emotions and the things that are happening behind closed doors to her that are causing certain emotions, she's able to like actually picture them as being something completely different than what they are. And there was one video clip that they played, or audio clip that they played in the trial, and Johnny had his hand on her leg. He removed his hand for something, and in that action, she took that as him rejecting her. She took that as him not wanting her, like wanting to be away from her, whatever. And so it's like this distortion of reality and this creation of this storyline that these individuals can go through. And so I do think that there is a bit of like almost like a psychosis here, where you're kind of living this parallel or alternate reality than what's actually happening. And so I think that makes a lot of sense given what BPD, borderline personality disorder, can experience. They can feel intense mood swings. They can be uncertain about how they see themselves. I'm just reading kind of where this came from on the Institute of Mental Health. Their feelings of others can change quickly. They swing from extreme closeness to extreme dislike, which we can see here with the Moon in Libras wanting that closeness, wanting a partnership, and then Mercury in Aries really wanting what they want and to be argumentative and aggressive and that sort of thing. So this leads to an instability in relationships and emotional pain. We can see all those things in this aspect as well. And we can see a dissociation with reality that is also common with BPD. So that's one element. So this is a T-square, which means that it's funneling a lot of energy and frustration into the planet that's at the apex, which is Mars and Neptune, particularly Neptune at the right degree. And so a lot of like energy and frustration is coming into Neptune, and she has the potential to transcend this into a spiritual plane, to be compassionate, to try to find universal understanding between her and others. But instead, kind of how it's coming out are through the frustrated elements of Neptune, which is going to be distortion of reality, lies, and basically deceiving others in whatever way that you would like to deceive them. Okay, the other T-square that's going on here is with Juno opposite Chiron squaring Jupiter. We will see Jupiter really triggered a lot in the synastry and the transits and all the things that are really relevant to kind of what's going on in her chart, which is interesting because Jupiter is typically a planet that's really positive. It's usually a planet where we see experience, especially in Pisces, where we experience a lot of blessings and abundance and love. But we do have to note that Jupiter is in a harsh aspect to these planets or to these asteroids, and it is in the 8th house. So Jupiter in this sense in other senses might have a positive reflection in her life, but in this area that we're talking about, it does have a damaging effect, and in the way that Jupiter can create grandiosity and blow things out of proportion and expand things. And so we're going to really see that with this. So Jupiter is at, excuse me, Jupiter is at the apex. She has Chiron in Gemini in the 11th house. So there's definitely, with this opposite Juno, there's definitely this wounding around relationships and commitment. And I think that where we have Chiron, there's typically quite a bit of fear. And Chiron in the 11th, there is a wounding also around our sense of belonging. And I think that is probably partially why she's concerned with her reputation. Although I think it's mostly the Sun conjunct the North Node, which is super important. I'll talk about that later. But yes, Chiron in the 11th is this wounding around feeling like I want to belong, but in a past life or in my childhood, I wasn't necessarily accepted, or I had issues within my community. And opposite Juno, again, this is really going to come up in her relationships. So maybe there was this feeling or this wounding around not being loved, not being accepted, not being devoted to. And with the square to Jupiter in the 8th, I think it expanded her insecurities. The 8th house has a lot to do with where we are most insecure and uncertain of ourselves. And so I feel like in her relationships, specifically her marriages and committed partnerships, is where we're really going to see this come out for her, this level of uncertainty in herself. And yeah, so that's all I'll say about that. So I want to talk about the Sun opposite Pluto and the Sun conjunct the North Node and Pluto conjunct the South Node, because this is really, really, really big. So I will say that the Sun conjunct the North Node is a lot of a conflated sense of ego or inflated sense of ego and sense of self. The Sun is our ego. The Sun is our worldly presence, our career, and it's like where we draw our confidence from. And with the North Node, it's going to inflate that. So we can see this as to why she might have a lot of career success, why she became like notable or witnessed in the public. And and we can also see why there's this like grandiosity and this desire to be seen, because the Sun is the most visible planet in the zodiac, and the North Node is again creating this they call it like the head of the dragon, and it's this ravenous, insatiable part of ourselves that we have to have more and more and more of, whatever that is. And when someone is out of balance or is not spiritually in tune or is unconscious about something in their life, the planets on the North Node can become extremely exaggerated and can become toxic in themselves. And so this is her Sun. You know, she's achieving this great purpose. She feels like she has this this desire to be seen and this purpose in the world, and that's great. But then it becomes too big because she has this insatiable desire to be seen. And this actually goes directly in line with one of the expert witnesses and what they said about her personality for having histrionic personality disorder, which is defined as an excessive attention-seeking behavior, usually beginning in childhood, including inappropriate seduction and excessive desire for approval. So this is really what this is about. It's about seeking our identity in others, seeking approval in others, trying to be witnessed in order to feel like we are worthy. And a lot of this comes back to her childhood with this opposition with Pluto, where you can see when the Sun is opposite Pluto, the typical thing with this is having an abusive father, a really controlling or really dominant or really powerful parental figure, typically the father, and that person has a really big impact on their life. And this can often be physically or emotionally abusive. That's not always going to be the case. Again, I'm taking the extremes here. But with Amber, this is the case. Her dad was an alcoholic and he was abusive. So we can see this very classically here with the Sun opposite Pluto, that she kind of had this imprint of abuse from childhood. Unfortunately, this doesn't always mean that you are then going to become abusive yourself. However, the sun is our identity, and sun opposite Pluto can signify that you are manipulative, that you are a liar, that you are abusive yourself. And it's because, again, you experienced this as a child. This is how you were raised, this is how you were taught. And so you kind of embody that yourself. Does that mean everyone who has had an abusive childhood or has an abusive aspect in their chart is going to embody that? No, but that is something that is possible, right? Like we have some sort of free will here about how we're going to reflect our chart out in the world. And so it is very possible that she is abusive. I mean, we can see it obviously in her videos, right? Like we can see that she is, I mean, they both are, honestly, but she's definitely the aggressor in a lot of these instances. And we can see that with this sun opposite Pluto. We can also see it with the South Node, with Pluto in the South Node. The South Node is representing often our karma. And when we have the South Node, wherever we have the South Node, it's representing who we were in a past life. So with Pluto here, she definitely has a heavy karma from past life where she was likely controlling or manipulative to others and taking advantage of people who are less fortunate than her. Again, that's not always going to be the case. It depends on the rest of your chart. But kind of based off of how her life is playing out at this point, I really do think that that's how she was in a past life. And so I think that it's all coming full circle. She was abusive in a past life, so she has a childhood where she experiences abuse, and then she doesn't break that pattern. She just keeps going, and it's going to keep going until she has certain realizations. And that's what these T-squares are trying to help her see through crises, through things breaking down, through things becoming really, really hard on her. She's supposed to be able to see where her insecurities are leading her astray in her relationship, where her aggression and her lies and her manipulation are leading, her and her partners astray and ruining her life in a sense. But will she see that? I don't know. She also has Mars making a quincunx to Chiron. This can also be a possibility that she's either too passive or abusive. And I think it's kind of, with all of these other things going on, it's the latter. And then we can also see with Juno, this marriage asteroid next to Uranus, we can see that there's an instability in marriage and partnerships, like expecting the unexpected, not really knowing how it's going to be. And one of the things that we see here as well is she has Saturn here, which is indicating having a lot of heaviness and karma around her relationships. She also has Saturn opposite Chiron, which can be very emotionally challenging and can deal with some karmic relationship, especially around the father, where they are absent, they are abusive, and they're repeating these dynamics in their relationships. And you can see this parallel going on between Johnny's mother and Amber, their similarities, and Amber's father and Johnny. And you will see this in their charts, that they have all this energy to repeat these patterns with their childhood in their relationships. And so it's no surprise that they're going through all of this right now, to be completely honest. I also wanted to show one last thing, which I think I don't have on here. So Amber also has Black Moon Lilith conjunct her Venus. Black Moon Lilith is an asteroid related to the shadow feminine. And it's kind of where women might, or anyone might, kind of try to gain power through relationships and through her sexuality in a kind of negative or shadowy way. And it's good to embrace the shadow, but when it's with Venus and sun opposite Pluto, it's like she's using this femme fatale kind of energy to gain the things that she wants in life. And I think it's ultimately not serving her. And so that's also a part of the histrionic personality disorder that I thought I would mention. So I do agree with the medical professional they brought in on Johnny's team. I'm sure the defense will poke holes in it and all of this, but I do think that looking at her chart, she at least has the potential for this to be the case. Again, I am interpreting the extreme of this, and there's gray and there's in-betweens, and there's also ways that we can evolve from our chart to become more conscious and not live out these certain patterns. So I do want you guys to keep that in mind. Okay, let's look at Johnny now. Johnny. Okay, so Johnny also has a T-square, and his T-square is between Pluto and Juno, Chiron, and the Sun. So first of all, as I mentioned, Juno's the marriage asteroid. So Amber had Saturn and Uranus next to hers, which brings instability and heaviness and karma around her marriage. And Johnny has Pluto, the planet of manipulation and control and abuse on his marriage asteroid. So this can represent partners that bring that out within you, or just your marriage kind of being like that, or attracting partners like that. So that's one element of this. So this is definitely talking about his marriage right now. It's opposite Chiron, which means it's triggering all of these emotional wounds from childhood. Chiron in the 8th house is always very challenging. The houses for Amber were not exact because we don't have her birth time, but the houses for Johnny are right. And Chiron in the 8th house is basically a traumatic thing to have that can indicate some kind of crises, abuse, death in the family, like something tragic happening in childhood that leaves us having a lot of difficulty being emotionally vulnerable with others and feeling safe to open up to others. And so we have this, and it's perpetuating the cycle with Pluto and Juno here, where, you know, you're having a partner that's controlling and abusive, and it's like that's an equally unsafe environment. And so these things are perpetuating each other through their toxicity, and it's squaring his Sun in the 11th. So there is part of him that is identifying with this pain. He has definitely formed, I think, a lot of his life and his personality and his choices around this pain and this wounding around his childhood abuse. Sun square Chiron is extremely difficult. It makes us feel like we are not enough. The Sun is our ego, it's our identity. And again, Chiron is that wounding that we experience in childhood. And so it can feel like we don't have the support that we need. We're not loved for who we are. And it can create a serious lack of confidence, actually. Even though he appears quite confident, the reason he's attracting these types of partners is because he's not confident, because he's had this breakdown in childhood happen. And this, when he was vulnerable, he was shot down. And so it has become part of him to be wounded. And now he's kind of carrying the storyline. His father, I know, he said his father kind of just allowed the abuse to happen. His mom to just kind of run over Johnny and run over his father and just like not say or do anything. And the Sun is representative of the father. So the Sun squaring Chiron is this passivity that he experienced with his father not stepping up to the plate. And his father probably lacked confidence, and that's why that happened. And it kind of got passed down to Johnny, this passivity, like lacking confidence, not being sure. And then that feeds into creating the hotbed of kind of abusive, manipulative, controlling partners. And it attracts those people because you are going to withstand it, essentially. And so that is the T-square that he has in his chart. He also has a kite in his chart, which is extremely potent and is here to help the individual essentially surpass some type of lesson that they may have experienced in another lifetime, especially with whatever they have at the apex, which for Johnny is his moon in the South Node. So essentially what's going on here is that Johnny, this is a lot to break down. Okay. Let me start off with the moon in the South Node. So the moon in the South Node is at the apex, as I mentioned, and the moon is related to the mother. The South Node, whenever I see this on the moon, is always indicating a troubling relationship with the mother. And it typically creates someone that struggles to open up emotionally, especially moon in Capricorn, where it does not like to be. It feels already stifled and uncomfortable expressing emotion. So on top of that, it's with the South Node, which is limiting it. It's taking out its energy, and it's creating a difficulty being vulnerable and expressive of how he feels, which is, again, why he's probably triggering Amber so much, because she has all these insecurities about not being loved, not being wanted, needing attention. And then he has trouble expressing emotion. So they're triggering each other by him leaving. And then she gets angry and she's in this cycle of abuse. And anyway, I think you guys understand what I'm trying to say. So the moon south node creates somebody who has a lot of trouble expressing emotions. They can have a toxic mom growing up that kind of shows why they might struggle with this. And what they tend to do, especially with Capricorn, is you need to self-isolate and be alone to fully understand what you're feeling and to feel safe in expressing it. The south node on top of that adds in the layer of pushing emotions down, trying not to deal with them, not facing them fully. And then like it all kind of comes out at once. And that's why we see these kind of aggressive, volatile moments from Johnny. I bet you he 9 times out of 10 is very calm and is almost like stoic and repressing how he feels. And then he has explosive moments where all of it comes out and it's almost like it needs to purge out of him on those specific days. And it could maybe even last days at a time. So that's kind of what we will see with this. Again, the south node with the moon causes a very troubling relationship with the mother. And we know that his mother was abusive. So there's always going to be that struggling element here. So this is what's being resolved through the kite. The apex planet is trying to bring about essentially better emotional processing. But all these things are kind of contributing to why he's having trouble. So another reason why he has trouble is with the north node in the 12th house. I think he very much is an internal person. He's got Cancer here as well. So it's like all these emotions he needs to be isolated for. He needs to feel like separate. He might not even understand how he feels. And also he has a lot of self-sabotaging, escapist tendencies. And so the north node here can indicate how that can kind of contribute to this overall picture of him not being able to process his emotions. On top of that is trining Chiron the 8th, which is, again, his insecurity around being vulnerable because he was hurt when he was vulnerable as a child. And it's trining Neptune and Black Moon Lilith in the 4th house. So Neptune and Black Moon Lilith combined are essentially his shadow feminine, like that comes out in relationships, is with Neptune. So it's like he cannot see like people clearly when I see this. Like he, there may have been, especially in the 4th house, there may have been like certain lies within the household or addiction already existing within the household, because Neptune typically represents that. And that like feeds his shadow, if that makes sense, in relationships. So his like addiction, his inability to perceive people correctly, idealizing partners, all of that feeds into this shadow that kind of grows and develops its own life. So all of this is feeding into his inability to process emotions, but so this kite is somewhat negative, to be frank. It's a more challenging kite with not a lot of like, you know, help essentially from these planets. It's very challenging if I saw this in someone's a client's chart. Okay, so I kind of want to talk more about his personality. So in relationships, Johnny has Venus conjunct Mercury. So one of his relationship planets, we all have Venus as a relationship planet. His other relationship planet is Saturn, which we'll talk about in a second, because it's the ruler of his 7th house, the traditional ruler of Aquarius. Okay, so Venus's relationship planet is conjunct Mercury in Taurus in the 10th house. So very flowery speaker, very poetic, almost like refined and elegant in the way that he comes across, which is why he's such an artist. Venus is a planet of artistry and Mercury is a planet of intellect, and they're both in the sign of Taurus, which is artistry as well, especially artistry with the hands. So I could see why he wants to paint, why he plays the guitar, and also why he acts as well. So he has these planets that he kind of embodies. And it's one of the reasons why people are very attracted to Johnny. And I think it's one of the things that people, Venus in the 10th, essentially the 10th house is your career. Venus is your likability factor. So typically when I see Venus in the 10th, you have good rapport and relationships with the people that you work with and the public. And so I definitely feel like he is like well perceived because of this aspect. It also makes someone, besides being more likable, it actually makes them like more sociable and kinder. Like, it's not a manipulative thing. Like, I'm just going to manipulate you into liking me. It's like, oh, I'm more refined. I'm creative. I'm interesting. I'm beautiful. And that's why you like me. I just have this je ne sais quoi about me. And he definitely does. On top of that, one of his other likability factors is his sort of rebelliousness, which we see with Uranus conjunct Mars in the first house. He's definitely not someone that you can pigeonhole. He is certainly not someone that you can define. You can see him even in the courtroom, in the way that he dresses, in the way that he said he wanted to go against kind of being typecasted and all this in Hollywood, becoming bobbleheads or whatever he said. He wanted to be an artist. He's had specific movie roles and choices because of how he defined himself and his kind of rebelliousness. So people admire that in him. They admire his artistry, his refined sense of self, as well as this kind of rebelliousness. But we can see this come into play later on as something that can be negative in his life. Uranus conjunct Mars, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so Saturn is his planet, is his relationship planet, and it's squaring Venus, and it's in the 7th house. So it's also squaring Mercury. So Saturn in the 7th house can signify a few things. I'm going to go to the negative or the extremes of what it can mean, and then I'll get into like some of the more positives. So, or maybe I'll just kind of stick with it. I don't know. We'll see. So Saturn in the 7th can indicate attracting someone with an age difference, usually someone older than you, but it could be someone that's younger than you. So that's one thing. It usually means meeting people later in life as well, marrying people later in life. It also means having trouble in relationships, especially because Saturn is retrograde. So he has boundary issues in his relationships. It's squaring Venus. So as a child, he had trouble receiving affection when I see this. And he has internalized a lot of that and has trouble then continues to kind of attract partners that he has trouble receiving love and affection from, especially because Mercury is squaring Saturn, which leads one to being much more pessimistic or depressive and just kind of like feeling more lonely. So it can make you really disciplined in your mind, but you can have trouble communicating. You can have trouble feeling really connected to people. And so I get this feeling of like loneliness in his relationships. And just feeling like he doesn't necessarily have that, specifically these intimate partnerships, he doesn't have that like true love and affection that he really craves, because he is attracting people where they may be emotionally unavailable, or they're not physically affectionate, or they're volatile, like in the case with Amber. So he has this essentially from childhood that he's playing out today. Another very important part of this, these are in a strong aspect. Mercury squaring Saturn, Venus squaring Saturn is classic in someone who avoids confrontation. So you need to get something done. You need to resolve something, but you kind of don't want to deal with it. So this is typical of the person who walks away. This is typical of somebody who is terrified of being assertive or having emotional disputes. And again, this is stemming from his childhood with his mom, how his dad reacts, how he's reacting. And so this isn't his nature. This is one of his first tendencies, is to walk away when there's a conflict, which again triggers Amber, and this whole thing kind of goes downhill. However, he also does have some elements of potential for like volatility and aggression, which I'm going to talk about. So first of all, he has, as I mentioned, he has Venus square Saturn, which creates that retreating and that difficulty connecting. But he also has Venus squaring Uranus. So Venus is, again, our connection planet, but Uranus creates this desire for freedom, for space, for change and liveliness and fun, and like doing things that feel rebellious but like feels good to you. And so Venus square Uranus people can sometimes have trouble committing because they desire all those things, and that doesn't always necessarily coincide with having a stable relationship. However, with the square with Saturn, that's actually going to make him have more commitment to him than someone without that. But Venus squaring Saturn can create a lot of instability in relationships. And it just means like a lot of ups and downs, attracting partners who are unstable. And we saw with Amber, she had Uranus and Juno together. So she also has this instability in her chart in relationships. And so they're both kind of magnetizing towards each other. One thing about Venus with Uranus is that they will pull away when they feel like they're going to be rejected or they're going to be hurt. And so again, we can see this with Johnny walking away and becoming cold, becoming distant, which would then trigger Amber because he has this desire for his space, for his freedom, and to also protect himself from potential downfalls, from potential pain. And so again, this is where we start to see the cycle play out over and over again. So, okay, few things I want to mention. He also has, okay, so, sorry, I'm like really excited. I'm trying to do this super fast. So his IC, which is his home line right here, the 4th house cusp, has Scorpio on it, and Scorpio is ruled by Mars. So Mars is essentially his family planet. It's going to describe his childhood and his home life. So Mars is conjunct Uranus. What do you know? I just watched a little clip of him the other day where he said he moved around constantly as a child. He was always on the go, always moving to a new place, even if it was just moving to the place next door. His neighbors would all see them packing up and moving all their stuff next door. And so we can see this like instability in his home life. On top of that, we can also see Mars is conjunct Pluto. Very classic for a very aggressive home life and abusive home life. So these planets together is obviously pointing to the treatment that he received from his mother, but it's also something that he can embody himself. So he can become explosive. He can become jealous. He can become controlling. He can get really angry. But that doesn't mean that he will be. Sometimes with Mars conjunct Pluto, when you receive this abuse and everything, sometimes you can go in the opposite direction where you actually have trouble processing anger, you have a difficult relationship with it, and you kind of internalize and bottle up a lot of stuff instead of being able to express it because you had such an unhealthy show of it as a child. So it can really go either way. It doesn't mean that someone will always react consistently in the same way. If they bottle up anger, it doesn't mean that they'll never get angry, but it just means that generally they're pretty much always going to be more submissive and not do so well when they are feeling angry. And then maybe every now and then, again, they can express rage or can express frustration. So he does have this element of sort of instability in his chart. It is a wide conjunction, but I definitely think he would still feel this in his life because we do see this coming across in his childhood. So again, that is a potential, but there are also so many other factors of his chart indicating a retreat, indicating moving away. And so that could also be indicating that is really what's going to take priority. And then every now and again, having him like get angry or snap or whatever. So I don't know, like based off of both their charts, they both have the potential. They both have been abused in childhood. They both have the potential in their charts that shows that they have been abused and shows that they could be abused in the future, could be abusive in the future. Does that mean they are or they aren't? We don't know. For sure. I mean, obviously the trial knows. You can see what's going on in the tapes and everything, but it's not my job to tell you like what is actually going on. But I wanted to show internally where things are kind of playing out in their personality and how that relates to what we're seeing in this trial. A really big thing with Johnny also is his addiction. We can see he has some serious issues with that. Actually, I wanted to say one more thing before I get to that. As I mentioned, he has like Pluto conjunct Juno and its opposite Chiron. So I really think that this can indicate experiencing this like abuse and control and manipulation specifically in his relationships and his marriage. I know I already mentioned that, but that can be a factor in indicating that obviously Amber is guilty, for sure. Whether or not that means that Johnny is or isn't, I'm not sure about that part. You can definitely read the text messages, the things that he screamed to her, and just kind of like the volatility there. They're obviously quite toxic. To what degree he's been involved in that physically, I'm not sure. But again, I'll just leave that up to you guys to decide. Okay. So, yeah, the last thing I wanted to talk about was his addiction tendencies. So, he definitely has a propensity for addiction. With Neptune in the fourth, I also have, as my dad was also an addict. It just can indicate that there is like either lies or possible addiction in the household growing up. I'm not sure if his parents were or weren't, but I know it marks his childhood, and he actually started his addiction in his childhood to kind of avoid what was going on with his mom. So that is one element of this. He also has his moon square Jupiter, super, super common in things related to avoiding our emotions, because of these indicators here. He has trouble processing emotions. With this square with Jupiter, he avoids his emotions by going into excess, overindulging. And so we sometimes see this with people with food or with watching too much TV. With Johnny, it's specifically in the area of drugs, alcohol, all those things. He obviously has an issue with that. And so it lacks, typically with moon square Jupiter, there's a lack of self-control there. You can be an optimist and like this kind of good qualities, but it is really coming out in that area of not really having self-restraint when it comes to things that actually can harm you. And so I feel like they're trying to bring that up a lot in this case, and that doesn't necessarily ever equate to abuse, and like how someone acts, I should say, because like I said, my dad was an addict and he was a wonderful person. Obviously, everyone has flaws, but he was never aggressive at all. And so it's typically representing like emotional pain and challenging, like it's being challenging to process how you're feeling. And I see that a lot in his chart. And so that's why he has so much of this addiction and walking away, because he can't process how he feels. And so I don't necessarily see this as being like super aggressive, although the Mars with Uranus and Mars with Pluto can indicate that that is a possibility for him. So that's why I don't want to say he's not abusive at all, because he has that potential. Or it could just be representative of his childhood and something that he chose not to do. Just like with Amber, we can see that represented in her childhood, and she could choose to do it or not do it. Obviously, based off of the videos, she did it. Okay, so now in the next video, I'm going to get into the synastry and the transits.
Okay, so now we are looking at the synastry of Johnny and Amber together. And I have Johnny's chart on the inside because we know his house placements, and Amber's are on the outside. Okay, so one of the very first things that I noticed was some relationship hotspots. And one of these hotspots are going to essentially be where there's a lot of energy from both individuals. So whenever these hotspots are activated, there's going to be changes or an evolution in the nature of the relationship, which we're going to see with the transits coming up in a second. So this is super fascinating if you have a partner to track the transits to this specific hotspot of your relationship. So you can see with Johnny and Amber, they both have Venus at 25 and 26 degrees of Taurus. And Johnny Depp has his Mercury at 25 degrees of Taurus. So they have a tight hotspot here from 25 to 26 degrees. And maybe even 28 if we're going to include Amber's Black Moon Lilith here. And so we can expect, again, when there's a planet squaring these planets, opposing it, conjunct it, it's going to show some evolution in the relationship. And again, we'll get to that later. So in terms of attraction, this is going to indicate them having similar desires, similar interests. Typically, Venus and Taurus, they both might have an interest in more Venusian things, because Venus is in her home sign in Taurus. So this is going to mean that you might be interested in art or aesthetics, and I believe that they both are interested in art, interested in music, things of that nature. It's going to make them essentially kind of have overlap in hobbies, interest, and kind of like cultural desires or aesthetic desires, and even maybe ways of kind of expressing themselves physically or showing up and being affectionate within the relationship, or even kind of like the pace of the relationship and how they kind of go about that. They might have had similar desires in terms of that. However, Amber has Black Moon Lilith, which is the shadow feminine, along with her Venus. And so part of actually what makes Johnny attracted to her was this shadowy side of herself. This was a huge part of their relationship. And so it's not just, oh, Venus, the beautiful qualities. It's like Amber's Venus is, which is supposed to be a really affectionate, cooperative, loving planet, is mixed right along with her shadow side. And so Johnny was kind of attracted to both parts of these because his Venus is on her Black Moon Lilith. So we know that there's going to be some desire there, some quality there that he's attracted to. So he's pulled into her. They're both likely find each other very physically attractive. That's probably not an issue in the relationship, but the darkness there, while it is an initial attractor, can be, again, one of the things that kind of becomes an issue. Johnny's sun, which is on the inside, is loosely conjunct Amber's Chiron, not super tight orbs, like 7 degrees. However, this is concerning to me when I see some strong Chiron placements. Generally, we're going to see the relationship bring about insecurities in the other person. And the sun is representing your identity. And so Chiron here is a trigger. So it's like something about Johnny and his identity, his way of being, is triggering to Amber, which we know when we look at Amber's history with her father. There's a parallel there in their behavior. And so you can see that as a trigger for her. And then the Chiron can then make the sun person feel painful for being who they are, ashamed for being who they are, that type of thing. As they're triggered, they can then kind of put that pain on the other person. This can be a healing aspect, but you have to be highly evolved to not be kind of brought down by your triggers from your childhood. So that's an uncommon one to have in a partnership where things feel really strong and really healthy, because it's almost like Johnny's way of expressing himself is automatically a wound for Amber. Johnny's Chiron is also pretty much exactly on Amber's Jupiter. And as we've seen earlier, this Jupiter was involved in a T-square with her, a squaring with her natal Chiron, and then as well as with Juno right here. So we can see these kind of painful things come up in her relationship with this aspect here. And so basically his childhood wounding is like she is triggering his childhood wounding as well, essentially. So her insecurities, her possessiveness, her controlling behavior, any of the negative ways that this Jupiter will start to operate because of its fear that it's involved, that it feels with its square to Chiron and being in the 8th house. Again, normally Jupiter is really positive, but this Jupiter is struggling with these aspects, even though it is exalted in Pisces. So anyway, those possessive qualities and insecurities and things of that nature are bringing about the same kind of undertones that he would experience with his mother in his childhood. And I'm sure that same feeling also of using someone's vulnerability against them, because Chiron in the 8th house can have this feeling that it's not safe to be vulnerable with somebody because it wasn't for him. And so this Jupiter here is kind of pushing on that. And if this Jupiter were not in this T-square, I would say that this could be extremely beneficial, actually. Very healing, very beautiful. But in this relationship, while it may have initially felt like that, ultimately there was the negative side of it as well, which came out with Amber's insecurities and power plays. Okay. Also, Johnny's stellium here is all falling kind of in, I was gonna say, okay, sorry. Actually, I realized that Amber's houses are not correct because I wrote down some things in my notes and I'm realizing that I wrote down houses and that doesn't make sense with this. Okay. Johnny's moon south node. So this is again representing his challenging relationship with his mother and his challenge in emotionally processing things. So Amber's Mars is conjunct this moon. So what does Mars do and what does the moon do? Well, we think about the moon, as I mentioned, it wants to express our feelings, to show our true authentic nature in a vulnerable way. And it can only do that when it feels like it's really at home. And that's why the moon is associated with the home. One of many reasons. Mars is the very masculine, external, assertive quality to us. And it's the planet that's activated when we become very angry. And Mars is strong here in Capricorn, so it knows what it wants and is not afraid to go after and bulldoze or take what it wants. We just see this because of other aspects of her chart. Mars in Capricorn doesn't always bulldoze necessarily, but it has this leadership quality where it's willing to take the reins to make something happen, to get its desires met. And so what do we have when we have a planet that bulldozes and a planet that's sensitive and emotional and at home? We kind of have the potential for the soft underbelly of the moon to get irritated, inflamed, or be aggressively kind of attacked by Mars. And so essentially, Amber is really trying to pull out Johnny's emotions and trying to get him to be sensitive and vulnerable and express things to her, but she's doing it in an aggressive way and in a way that he actually isn't going to respond well to. Because we see his moon in Capricorn with the South Node, his moon already has trouble responding. So now that it's activated with anger, which is going to bring about, again, this resonance with what he experienced with his mother growing up, it's going to bring about emotion, but it's not really the desired response that we typically want in a relationship. And so Amber, again, is kind of poking and prodding and getting angry. And then this is reminding him so much of his mom, and he's having these deeper emotional experiences because of that. And this can be difficult to open up with this kind of aspect in a relationship. So this is quite karmic given his history. Johnny's sun is also opposite Amber's Uranus. So this can create instability in a relationship. This can create distance because Uranus is a planet of both instability and distance, and the sun is Johnny's identity. It's his fame as well. It's his career. It's his recognition. So there's something about this that's very destabilizing for their relationship and possibly for Amber and her well-being. So it can create some volatility in their partnership. Like, is he going away? That distance, like literally he's going away to film a movie, that distance. And then what does that do for me as an individual? Does that make me feel like emotionally compromised, or do I feel safe with that? And the other aspect of this as well is that she is also going to have a desire for freedom at times. The Uranus individual can be the one who, at the end of the day, wants to kind of break free. And so both of these people, with his career and her desire for freedom, are kind of pulling apart in many ways and maybe not always willing to compromise. Maybe not always willing to come together, come to the middle, to meet each other's needs. Especially because their moons are also squaring. Johnny has his moon in Capricorn, Amber has her moon in Libra, and they are making a square. So they are having different emotional needs. So As I mentioned, Johnny has trouble processing emotions. Moon and Capricorn individuals typically need space to themselves and time alone to process emotion. And they're usually going to, especially with the South Node, not necessarily always want to dive straight into that. And I think that it's going to, especially with the sextile with Neptune, it's going to indicate that sometimes he might have this desire to escape. It's just like a lot of escaping emotionally is what I see. Her moon in Libra is having more of a desire to deal with the issue. Libra is not typically the moon sign that we're like, oh, they're always dealing with all the issues. It really depends. I have friends who have moon in Libra who like to kind of skirt around things because they have that Venusian quality where they want to put people first and they don't want conflict. And then we have other moon in Libra individuals who are like diplomatic and kind of really good at handling conflict and kind of being in the middle. That's, of course, not really the case with Amber, given what we've seen in the rest of her chart, but we can see this desire to kind of promote the partnership, essentially, and resolve the conflict. So she does have this really deep innate desire to have this coupling effect, while he will tend to pull away. So she's going to want to express her needs through another, but then again, with her Mercury opposite her moon, she's quite self-centered, quite abrasive at times, or volatile with her emotions. And so, again, this can kind of make finding that true partnership much more difficult. Okay. And I think also at the same time, she does have trouble kind of connecting to reality. And so because of that, like I mentioned in her chart, this again makes the conflict even more difficult. Okay, moving on. Johnny's Mars is squaring Amber's Saturn. So Johnny's Mars is squaring Amber's Saturn. And this can be a challenging aspect that can take a toll emotionally on partners, because typically when we see Mars square Saturn, we are seeing another kind of battle of the wills, just like Uranus opposite the sun. Mars is a willful planet that desires what it wants, right? It just craves to assert its own sense of independence, and take what it wants as well, do what it wants in the moment. So this is Johnny's willfulness. This is his desire to travel if he wants to travel, drink if he wants to drink, and so on and so forth. And Amber's Saturn is this kind of stern force that's telling him, don't do that, don't be impulsive like that, that's bad for you. Or it can be a very critical voice of, oh, you want that? Like, that makes you dumb, kind of thing. So essentially what it does is that whatever Johnny is desiring or acting on, Amber can be cold or critical of, or demanding, or even pushy. And so the Mars can get very irritated with this, and then Saturn can come down even harder and be even more critical. So that's why these planets in square can be challenging in a relationship for longevity. Johnny's Saturn is squaring Amber's Venus. So Venus is also kind of a planet that just wants to show up and have fun, right? Like Mars is whatever you desire. Venus is similar, but it's more so from a place of pleasure or expressing your femininity, showing affection, the kinds of hobbies and things that she enjoys. This is in a square with Saturn, which means that even though this is like one of the things that they connected on initially, they had that similarity. His Saturn squaring it also makes her feel like there's something about what he enjoys that she also enjoys, but there's some way that he does it that's like restrictive, or some way that he does it that's holding her back or boring or outdated. And we can see this because she said, like, they said that they had an overlap in taste in music. But then when she would hang out with him and his friends and they play music, she would just say like, "Oh, these are just a bunch of old, boring men." And it's I want to go out and do something fun. And so it's that similar storyline of her wanting to just kind of pursue Venusian desires of having fun, socializing, being with friends, but feeling like her relationship with Johnny didn't quite meet those needs or held her back from actually pursuing them fully. And so this could make her feel like Johnny is a wet blanket, which can lead to resentment and emotional coldness and stonewalling between them. And Johnny has this natally, so he's kind of used to this. So that probably didn't bother him as much if he's a little bit used to it. Like if you have something natally, I personally don't think it becomes as much of an issue because you're already like used to it. You've already experienced it from childhood. You already have this kind of voice within your own head. So if someone else says something like that, it's not completely out of left field. It's not something that you've never experienced before. And so it's usually not, it doesn't hit as hard, but it can be an issue over time. Johnny's Pluto is also squaring Amber's Saturn, which is, again, here. And then Amber's Chiron is squaring Johnny's Pluto. Her Chiron is squaring his Pluto. So this is challenging, definitely bringing up a lot of like karma from these individuals, a lot of childhood woundings, which we've already talked about, and definitely playing into these Pluto concepts of power and control and manipulation, and also secrets, abuse, all those things, which is very common with Pluto. So we can see all those things kind of coming out to play. You would not want this in a relationship with a partner necessarily. But I will say with Synastry, I am, and kind of what I was saying at the beginning, I'm mentioning the extremes of everything, and I'm also kind of pointing out mostly all the bad stuff. So the chart, obviously everyone's charts are going to be different. We're always going to have bad Synastry aspects with a partner. We're not going to have only good things, and we don't want only good things because it gives us an opportunity to grow. So I just wanted to make that statement. If you have one of these things, like I have one of these things with my partner. So if you have one of these, like it's okay. Your partner, your relationship is not necessarily doomed to fail, but it's just something to be mindful of where you might have to put in a little extra work to get over something. I will say though, Chiron on a major planet or on a major on a major planet or major angle can be one of the more challenging ones to get over, and that's mostly because there can be some element of the childhood being brought up, and that's often something that we struggle to fully heal from. Let's talk about the transits. So we did talk about how there were hot spots in the relationship. So one of the hot spots that I mentioned was this 26 degrees of Taurus, which we can see right now. The North Node is actually activating this still. So it was exact around February and early March of this year. And it's still hanging out here though, which I feel like is drawing, especially since it's in the 10th house for Johnny, it's like really drawing the world's attention to it. There's like a lot of growth happening for both of them throughout this process with that North Node, but it can be this really uncomfortable process as well. And we're going to see why. And that's because Saturn is actually squaring this right here. So Saturn, you see, is at 24 Aquarius, is squaring 25 degrees of Taurus. And so what does that mean? When Saturn is squaring both of their Venuses, essentially what that's doing is it's showing, like the North Node is kind of amplifying it, showing it, but it's showing the pain in the relationship. It's showing where things broke down. And whenever Saturn is squaring Venus in our lives, it is creating a feeling of loneliness, or it's creating a feeling of not fully belonging, not having the nurturing that we need, having to deal with some difficult elements of a partnership. So I think that Amber is probably feeling that loneliness. I don't necessarily know that Johnny is, but I think that he is definitely feeling the difficulty, the emotional difficulty of airing out all of his dirty laundry. And so this is the huge hotspot being activated by a slow outer moving planet, whose transits in a square are a really big deal. So Saturn aspects, since they are so slow and so uncommon, mark big chapters in our lives. And so for their relationship, this is marking a big chapter of their point of contention and things kind of breaking down. And you can see for Johnny as well that this is his second Saturn return. His Saturn is now at 24. His natal Saturn's at 23 of Aquarius. And so his natal Saturn is in the 7th house of relationships. He's having all of this stuff come up back again. I'm sure back in 1993, when he first turned 30 and he had his first Saturn return, 92, 93, he was experiencing this intensity around relationships and maybe old kind of karma working out in his relationships. I know him and Winona Ryder, I think that's how you say her name, broke up around that time. And everyone said that they were so great together. And it's probably because a lot of this old stuff that he was reliving with his mom and all this stuff that he kind of brings, the shadows and the difficulties and challenges that he karmically kind of has in his relationships. And so all of that is being resurfaced right now again with the Saturn return. Whenever we have a Saturn return, it activates that Saturn, it activates those themes in our lives. And it asks us to handle it with more maturity and more grace the second time around. And so sometimes the situation will look really different, and sometimes it can be a repeat. And so it's quite interesting to see how this is coming up again for him. Another activation point or hotspot in their relationship is 14 or 13 degrees of Pisces, which we can again see Amber's Jupiter is on his Chiron, on Johnny's Chiron, which we mentioned before. And now this is being activated by Mars. What's interesting is that this Chiron for Johnny is squaring his sun, and Amber's Jupiter is squaring her Chiron. So this Mars essentially is making a square to Johnny's sun and a square to Amber's Chiron. So what that means is Mars is activating our need to fight, or it's showing a fight. So for Johnny, with a square to his sun, it's asking him to step up and fight for something in his life. There's some tension, there's some discord, and he needs to push to make his will happen, which is his sun. Mars squaring Chiron is there's discord, there's tension, and it's triggering all of our wounding. It's triggering all of the stuff from childhood. It's triggering all of our insecurities. So that's kind of what Amber's going through. So yes, they're both being activated into this fight through this conjunction here, but they're being activated in a really different way. So Johnny's, actually no, because Johnny's, the Mars is also on Johnny's Chiron. So it is triggering his wounding from childhood and insecurities as well. Especially because he's so scared of being vulnerable and having everything aired out. I think there's some healing here though for him, because I've seen him recently kind of admitting that there is, I don't like with the truth kind of will set you free type of thing. So I do think there's some healing here for him. However, I think that this is also extremely painful. So I think they're both having this reliving of their childhood. Ultimately, the Mars being on Amber's Jupiter is actually making her get a lot more recognition. So I think in that sense, there is this kind of broadening of her horizons. And I don't mean like her potential, but just like in the way that more people are seeing her, more people are in her orbit. But the square with Mars and the sun is definitely indicating this white knuckling of Johnny having to kind of fight for what he needs right now. Okay, let's see. Chiron is also on, let's look at Johnny's transit specifically. So Chiron is on Johnny's Jupiter, and that means that it is then squaring his moon south node. Because as I mentioned, this is triggering all this stuff from his childhood with his mom. And so I think that ultimately this is bringing up all that wounding, and then along with the Saturn return, it's asking him karmically to face his childhood again and how this has repeated into his relationships based off of the healing that he has not yet done. And with Mars on Chiron, it's saying it's time to heal, but it's forcing him to do it. It's doing it in an uncomfortable and abrasive public way with that square with his sun, bringing in his publicity, his career, his identity, which is really interesting. And the nodes are also squaring his Saturn. So the nodes here at 22 are squaring his Saturn in the 7th house. So again, this is huge for fated karma changing in his relationships right now. This was so fated. Whenever you see something with the nodes, this was meant to happen. This was meant to unfold for you to learn something. And then let's look at Amber. So as I mentioned, she's going through Saturn squaring her Venus. She's also having Pluto squaring her sun right now. So Pluto is approaching her descendant, her relationship line, about squaring her sun. So it is not quite there yet. It's within 4 degrees of her descendant and her sun. So it's up once Pluto hits 2 degrees of Aquarius, it's going to be sitting right here on her relationship line and squaring her sun. Which I kind of want to see when that's going to be. Let's put this ahead in time. So essentially, Pluto squaring your sun and even Pluto on your descendant is going to be a time in which she's likely to have some radical transformation of relationships, possibly. So this will be in 2024 when it first hits there. So this is a positive note that could be for her, some transformation of relationships. But ultimately, given the way that things are going right now and the fact that this is also squaring her sun, I really think that it's ultimately going to show that the public is not in her favor. Pluto on the descendant, Pluto is a planet of darkness, and it's coming into the area of other people in her chart, which can represent the public's opinion of her. And so she can get into a position where there are secrets revealed about her, more people coming to the surface, more negativity kind of coming out around her. So you think that this is done now? You think that she's like gonna go into hiding after this? No. Like 2024, she's gonna have much more of this come to the surface, and it's going to continue on because it's going to keep making it. It's going to go retrograde and then make another aspect again at 2 degrees in the future. And so this is not done. This is not going to be done anytime soon for her. And the sun squaring Pluto is a very challenging transit for her, especially with the North Node here. It's challenging her ego, her inflated sense of identity, her career, the public opinion, all of those things. I forgot, as I mentioned, we don't have her exact house placements. Okay, so I suppose you can ignore what I was saying about the Pluto on the descendant, because we don't know that this is her descendant. But Pluto squaring the sun is still relevant. So she is going to continue in 2024 to have challenges from the public against her career. So I don't know if there was another movie planning on coming out then, but I don't think it's going to go well. And she's really going to be forced to kind of face herself and her identity and her choices from up to this point in time. So again, I wish I could kind of go into the houses with her because I wrote down some other things, but I keep forgetting I don't have her exact time of birth, which means I can't talk about that specifically. But these are the transits that are going on right now for them. This is why this is becoming so popular in the media. Also, with the North Node and with that square with Saturn to their hotspot is why it's so contentious, so challenging for them. And why their synastry creates such an explosive relationship as well. So if you guys enjoyed this is definitely going to be demonetized because I say the word abuse so many times and I didn't want to bleep it out. So if you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate you sharing around so more people can find me. And if you want to leave feedback, you can do so in the comments down below. And if you want a reading that is a lot more positive than this, I promise I won't skew it so negatively, then you can check out my website, willowsbloom.com. I offer synastry readings there as well, birth chart readings, transits, forecasts, everything that you're looking for. And it can give you a lot of insight into why you're going through what you're going through and when that will end. So I hope you enjoy this and I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye.